From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. At 16 minutes past 8 on the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, the world changed, and the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation in Tokyo almost immediately noticed that something was up.
A regional station has just gone down, which is not unusual. That happens from time to time. What is strange is that the backup line has also failed. Given that this is really quite odd, they report this to the headquarters of the Japanese General Staff, the Army. And they've also had a report from the Railway Telegraph, who said that they've lost contact with that area as well. There are also reports that there's been an explosion. The Army are very confused by this because they have got access to radar and they haven't picked up large numbers of enemy aircraft, so there probably wasn't a major air raid. There isn't a weapons dump in that area, so there's nothing there which would cause a large explosion. And it seems quite obvious to them that there's been a mistake, but they keep on trying to make contact with the city and are met with total silence. As a response to that, they say to a young officer, get in a plane, fly out there, and find out what, if anything, has happened in Hiroshima. 100 miles away from the city, this officer sees a very strange cloud of smoke. And when he and his pilot get there, what they see is extraordinary and terrible destruction that nobody had ever seen before.
The force from which the sun draws his power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
Today, it is 80 years since that deadly, world-changing bomb was dropped. 80,000 people died instantly, tens of thousands more estimated to have died in the weeks and months afterwards. And ever since, the morals of what was done have been debated. We'll look at why the US dropped the bomb and what agitated Times readers in 1945 wrote to the editor about it. The story today. 80 years since the bomb that changed the world.
I'm Jack Blackburn, and I am the history correspondent for The Times.
Can you rewind for us, first of all, Jack, and just explain how Japan actually got involved in the Second World War, and obviously dragging the US in as well?
So Japan was not involved in the big ideological clash, which was in part behind the war in Europe. Namely, on a very basic level, the war in Europe is about freedom and democracy versus fascism. What they're interested in is imperialism. They are very determined to have a wider empire. And so they see an opportunity in the early 40s. They've already been at war with China for a number of years as part of this imperial drive. And what they need is resources, in particular oil, which the Japanese home islands don't have.
Very 19th century of them.
It is very 19th century. It is an absolute hangover. But you get to this stage in 1941 when the European powers are completely bedraggled with what's happening with Europe. So Japan decides basically to seize the opportunity. There's one problem, though. There are American interests. You cannot go on a campaign in the Far East without upsetting America. So this leads to the famous attack on Pearl Harbor.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment.
The basic idea is to smash the American Navy there, thereby disabling it. And meanwhile, you're also smashing the Allies. And they do this. They actually advance very quickly through British and other imperial interests and colonial interests, and actually assemble quite a vast amount of territory by the end of the spring of 1942. But they haven't damaged the American Navy sufficiently.
But more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
And at the Battle of Midway that year, there is a very significant American victory, and slowly but surely, Japan is pushed back in places like the Philippines and Malaysia and Burma. And by 1945, it's nearing game over.
And throughout this time, we obviously now know that the US was working on this game-changing weapon. What was actually happening behind closed doors in the build-up?
So all alongside the Second World War, both in Europe and in Asia, there has been the fear of a nuclear weapon. In 1938, you really have got the demonstration of the theory of the idea of an atomic weapon, which in very basic terms is the idea of nuclear fission, of splitting an atom and releasing large amounts of energy and creating a vast explosion. And Germany is ahead in this, and this is a cause of great concern. A number of countries are trying to respond to this, but it is America which clearly has the greatest capacity. And so America commissions the Manhattan Project. And this is a thing which is now perhaps most recently famous for the film Oppenheimer. So this takes several years and is mainly being conducted in the middle of the New Mexico desert by J. Robert Oppenheimer and his team at the Los Alamos laboratory.
And people will remember Cillian Murphy in that film, obviously famously having the Trinity test where, the example is laid out and that enormous steel tower that it was standing on top of is pulverized. But why, as we approach what we now know as the end of the Second World War, why did the US start to think or plan that the way to hit back at Japan was to use this bomb, if it was already the case that Japan was on the slide?
There is absolutely no way that Japan can win the war, but they're also not showing any sign of surrendering, which means that you are going to have to launch a massive amphibious assault on the Japanese home islands. This is going to be very lengthy and complicated. The estimates of the potential casualties run into the millions. And it's quite evident that the Japanese regime, which is very militaristic, but is also built on a centuries-old philosophy which abhors the idea of surrender, they are quite willing to do this. Even those who think that surrender is quite a good idea are rather hopeful that they will be able to get better terms, particularly if America is going to pay a very large human cost on the beaches of Japan.
And even though Japan doesn't know that the US has this bomb, the US does warn Japan quite sternly that something dreadful is coming if you don't fold sharpish.
Harry Truman, the new president, he is at the Potsdam conference in Berlin. This is the conference which is, A, setting up the new world order in Europe, but also organising how they kill off the war in Japan. And they issue the Potsdam Declaration. This calls for the unconditional surrender of Japan, and in it has a warning of prompt and utter destruction.
It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum.
Which is a phrase that is noticed in Japan because it's a big claim. But Japan rejects the idea of unconditional surrender. And on we seem to be progressing towards this very long, drawn-out conflict.
And we know, obviously, that utter destruction of a kind does come, but it is also, as they promise on the 26th of July in the Potsdam Declaration, it is quite prompt because it's the 6th of August when the bomb is dropped. On that day in Hiroshima, before the bomb is dropped, I mean, what kind of a place is it? What is it like?
It's quite a big city and quite an old city. It's nearly 400 years since it was a castle, built on a port on Hiroshima Bay, and It has got these classic wooden Japanese buildings, and it's also got a lot of modern work. It has, to an extent, benefited from the war because it is a military centre. There is an army and navy training colleges nearby. It's got a population of around about 300,000 people, and it also has been very lucky. It's never been bombed. And whilst air raid sirens go off regularly, on the morning of the 6th of August 1945, the people of Hiroshima wake up and they've been lucky again, as far as they can see. Despite the sirens going off in the night, another day, no bombs.
And what about on the American side of things? On the 6th of August, how are they preparing for this mission?
Well, preparations have been going on for a few weeks at this point. The missions are going to be launched from an island called Tinian, which is north of Papua New Guinea in the Pacific. So they're building up on this island.
The crew has had their final briefing on weather and air-sea rescue. Only yesterday they have been told of the true power of the weapon they are to carry. The massive bomb has been loaded.
And at 2 a.m, on this August the 6th, they're loading up the bomb, which is called Little Boy.
3 parts, each in a different plane for safety. It had the equivalent destructive power of 20,000 tons of TNT.
And they are packed into a convoy.
2 B-29s were to fly the mission, 1 to drop the bomb, 1 to observe and record.
Led by the Enola Gay, which is under the command of Colonel Paul Tibbets.
The pilot of the bombing plane had named it Enola Gay after his mother, giving her an unexpected and perhaps unwelcome immortality.
So at 2:45 in the morning, the convoy leaves.
The Enola Gay took off with the first ever atomic weapon on board.
And they head north to Japan. And it takes nearly 4 hours to reach the Japanese coast. Ahead of them is a weather plane and an instruments plane called the Great Artiste.
With the observers and measuring instruments. One of them carried a 16mm camera with which he made this record of the flight and its result.
And their job is to record this attack, both in terms of the scientific effects that it has, but also to catch it on imagery and on camera.
And at this point, they don't know what their destination is.
They knew certainly that they were heading to this general area, and Hiroshima was one of a number of targets which had been considered. Famously, other targets included Yokohama and Kyoto. Kyoto was removed from the list because Secretary Stimson of the US government made a point that it was of such cultural value that the eradication of it would be unforgivable, not just within Japan, but more broadly. So it's when the weather plane reports that it's clear over Hiroshima at about 7:30 local time, they know what their target is. So it is creeping on towards 8 o'clock in Hiroshima, and the Enola Gay is fast approaching.
We had a window about 8 inches in diameter, which we could look out, but we could see the city as we came in. We had wonderful, clear, visual weather conditions.
It reaches the altitude of 31,000 feet, and that is from where the little boy will be dropped.
Jack, as we approach the anniversary of VJ Day, you are taking us through one of the key events that led to victory over Japan, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We were just hearing about the Enola Gay, 31,000 feet, ready to drop the bomb. What happens?
The man who pulls the trigger, as it were, was Major Tom Ferriby, who's the bombardier in the Enola Gay. And this may seem slightly odd, but there were very specific targets for where the bomb needed to be dropped, which you might think was not necessarily given the enormous destructive power of the bomb. But Major Tom Ferriby is scanning Hiroshima for the Ioi Bridge. That is where he needs to, and he spots it. And at 8:15 a.m. and 15 seconds, he lets fly.
The Enola Gay released it and banked sharply. The first atom bomb in the world fell through the bright August morning towards the silent city of Hiroshima.
The bomb falls and basically operates almost like a gun. A bit of cordite behind one piece of uranium ignites, and it fires one piece of uranium into another. This is at just under 2,000 feet. In fact, we can be very accurate about it. 1,968 feet. And within milliseconds of that, the temperature of Hiroshima has reached that which is not of this earth. The men have seen footage of the Trinity test, so they have a little bit of an idea of what's coming, but nothing can really prepare them for seeing it up close.
As soon as the bomb went off, the whole inside of the airplane just lit up as if someone had set off a flashbulb. And then we crowded to the window and saw just the whole city completely covered in smoke with this very tall mushroom cloud rising from it, which now everyone associates with a nuclear weapon. But it was the first time we'd ever seen anything like that.
Instantaneously, in a half-mile radius, everybody is wiped out. The only things that are left behind, in many cases, are the shadows of people where they were standing or sitting. They're burnt into the floors and the walls behind them. A fireball blows up over Hiroshima. It's 900 feet in diameter. That reaches a temperature of 7,000 degrees Celsius. On the ground, the temperature is 4,000 degrees Celsius. As you go further out, people are burnt by the radiation. You get pictures of people who have got kimonos burnt into their skin. It's truly, truly horrifying. And those wooden buildings that I mentioned earlier are exactly what you don't need in this scenario. They burn very easily, carrying the destruction further and further.
So why, even though they suffered such immense destruction after the bombing of Hiroshima, did they not immediately surrender? Why the delay?
To put it simply, it wasn't enough to shift the political dial. The people who still believed that surrender was abhorrent still believed that surrender was abhorrent. There was also no indication that this was going to happen a second time. Essentially, there was a lack of understanding of how the world had changed. Arguably, the bigger problem for the army came a few days later when Russia declared war on them. That was seen as a far greater difficulty. But then, of course, things develop a second time.
And it does happen again. Just 3 days later, another bomb is dropped, this time on Nagasaki.
Yes, and it's a bigger bomb. This is called the Fat Man, whereas the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons, this was 21. So the question of why go again is pretty straightforwardly answered by the American strategy. Yes, you've demonstrated that you have this immense power and have unleashed this terrible destruction. But you have to demonstrate that you can do it again and again and again. If there's a sense of it's actually taken a tremendous amount of effort to generate one bomb and that these bombs are not a frequent occurrence, then the motivation for Japan to surrender is significantly less. Oddly, many people will not know that it wasn't meant to be Nagasaki, it was meant to be Kokura, but they could not see the target there. They tried 3 times, they couldn't see it, so they moved on to the next one. Despite the fact that they were running short on fuel and they really needed to get back to an island, they proceeded to Nagasaki, where they couldn't see much else either there. There was cloud cover, but at a crucial moment, there was a break, and the bombardier said, "Bombs away," then immediately corrected him and said, "Bomb away." And destruction was unleashed on Nagasaki. 40,000 people had been wiped out instantaneously.
And taken together, these two bombings, what was the toll on human life between the two? I guess over a course of maybe even weeks and months because of the radiation effects.
Yes, there is an extraordinary thing which happens in the days following where this strange sickness descends upon the cities. It's known in Japanese as the atomic bomb illness. We now know it as radiation poisoning. Basically, people go down with diarrhea, vomiting, anemia, and then they just drop down dead. So there is, again, huge debate about exactly how many people died as a consequence of the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb. It's thought that by the end of 1945, some 246,000 people had died as an upper estimate. And of course, the overwhelming majority of those people were civilians.
It was very soon after the first bomb was dropped that civilians in the UK had views about what had happened in Japan, the morality and the ethics of it. And we can get a clear view of that all these years later in the Times' archive, which my colleague Tom Whipple has been leafing through.
Back then, and in fact until sort of quite a bit, several decades afterwards, the front page of the Times was always classified ads. So, no matter what the news, this was the place you advertised for a new butler, or you said you've got a large stock of cooking apples for sale is one of the adverts on this day. But in deference to the news, very, very occasionally, the editor put a small bit of it on the front. And in this case, in the late London edition on the 7th of August, so a day after the bomb was dropped, there are the 4 words in the top right-hand corner, the first atomic bomb. And this told, even without just the fact of them being put there, told readers that something momentous had happened. And then you go into the coverage of it, and our headline is, rain of ruin from the air. We talk about people being seared to death. We talk about how this bomb has harnessed the basic power of the universe. It's not a bad first draft of history, but then that's it. There's a lot going on, and this might have felt like just another bomb. But then what I find is interesting is the next day, slowly over the course of the week, the sense of the gravity of it emerges. The next day, if you turn to the letters pages, there is a single letter. It's from the president of the Royal Society, who's also a Nobel Prize winner, Sir Henry Dale, and he's saying that this has, as he calls it, the threat of final disaster to civilization.
And what of the readers as the days go on? I mean, where do they stand on the morals of what unfolded?
You get waves. On the 10th, we run a block of letters, and these letters are broadly, carefully condemnatory, I think would be how you would put them. These are people saying, hang on, do we really want to be the people who do this? Several of them make the same point, that we have just been condemning the Germans. So Ian Barton, just a reader, he says, we protest at the Germans' indiscriminate bombing when they sent rockets over here, but this new weapon is 1,000 times more indiscriminate and barbarous. Shall we not lose our souls in the process of using these new bombs? And you get the bishops weighing in. The Bishop of Southwell writes, the atomic bomb is a weapon too appalling to be at the command of sinful men. But then, the day after, you get people writing in. So there's someone called H. Marshall. He writes in, he's got this itemized things, 5 separate points. Do they forget? 1, the Japanese used our kindred for bayonet practice. And then he continues, and he's got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And he calls those writing in pathetically sentimental people. And in fact, this word sentiment is used elsewhere. So you're already getting, I guess, the battle lines being drawn between the pragmatists, or as they would see them, and the idealists.
And as that settled down, how did opinion change?
Well, you started getting quite big names weighing in. There were some quite senior military figures. There was William Beveridge. Beveridge pops up, who later on became a big advocate of the welfare state. And what they're saying is, perhaps there's a silver lining to this. Perhaps in its horror comes its antidote. And the very fact of these bombs means that war cannot be. You're already getting the kernel of the doctrine of deterrence emerging. We have to abolish war because war is so terrible. So there's this idea already that once that or twice is enough. That's it. This is done. It's proven, but now it cannot be used. And then you get the same sentiment, but coming at it from a different angle. You get A.A. Milne, the author of Winnie the Pooh, who also suffered from shell shock in the First World War. His view was there's nothing special about the atomic bomb. War is always hideous. It always does these inhumane things, and it always does them at scale. But his point is that the bomb might let us realize that. He says, war will cease when statesmen are intelligent enough to realize that it is a wicked game and a fool's game. The atomic bomb brings this moment nearer, not because it adds to the wickedness of war, for nothing could do that, but because it makes plain, even to the subhuman intelligence, the folly of it.
It's amazing there's such a spread of different types of people, as you say, from sort of armchair colonels to the author of Winnie the Pooh. I mean, going through all of it and leafing through all of it as you have, what has stuck out for you or surprised you about how readers absorbed all of this?
Already, basically all the arguments are there, including essentially the idea of deterrence, the idea of the destruction being so bad that war cannot happen again. And to an extent, these are the arguments that for the next 44 years determined the security status quo of Europe. And already they've essentially all been anticipated. There is a very immediate understanding of the gravity and importance of this, and a lot less flag-waving, chest-beating, dehumanizing and vengeance than perhaps my prejudices, I guess, about what humans are like and what we would have been like at the end of the war are. It's a lot more thoughtful, a lot more considered, and really a lot more intelligent.
Jack, thinking about the impact that all of this had on the war, Japan didn't surrender after the first bomb in Hiroshima. What happened after this second one in Nagasaki?
They don't surrender again. One person who absolutely will countenance it is Emperor Hirohito. He has firmly come to the conclusion that the war has to end. But he is a bit hamstrung in power, and various members of the cabinet find ways of divvying and delaying. But eventually, the emperor really does take matters into his own hands. He records this announcement of surrender, and it is put on a disc that is going to be broadcast the following day, and it's kept in the imperial palace. And that night, there's an attempted coup led by senior figures in the army, and it goes into the imperial palace, and there is bizarre acts of murder between people who have been colleagues. And there is also this farcical search for this disc. It fails, essentially, because there just isn't sufficient support. And by the dawning of the day, the emperor has not been subdued by this coup. And the army officers who've been leading it accept that it's over. One other army officer who is on a airbase elsewhere, when the surrender is announced, as he knew it was going to be, he gets into a plane and leads a final kamikaze mission. And people listened to this proceed right up to the point that they said that they were going down. The very strangest thing about it is that there isn't any record from the Allies' side of any kamikaze attack being suffered that day. So they simply just disappeared. And that was the final formal act of the Japanese war.
And it's amazing to think of Japan now, decades later. A booming economy, recovered incredibly quickly.
The recovery of Japan is stark. This was the largest amount of destruction suffered in one day by a single country. Within 40 years, having suffered this terrible attack, but also being led to destruction by its government in the wider war, it had become one of the world's leading economies and one of the world's leading innovators. That is very striking, as indeed is Japan's re-emergence as a G7 nation, as a major global partner alongside with Germany. The legacy of the war in Japan is considerable, both in terms of its impact on the Japanese people, but also on its impact on members of the Commonwealth and Britain and elsewhere. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki have emerged as these very strange mixtures of being a place where something terrible happened and the scars are still very visible. And yet they are also strangely symbols of hope.
That was the Times' history correspondent Jack Blackburn, and before him we heard from Tom Whipple, science editor and special correspondent. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Taryn Siegel, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.